As we wrap up our Joseph series this morning that we've been looking at over the last few weeks, we're going to be in Genesis 50 eventually, and that's the only scripture that will not be on the screen. So if you want to go ahead and turn to that and hold your place there, we'll be getting to that part of the story here in just a few minutes. Again, we're wrapping up that study on Joseph, and we've talked a lot over the last 7 or 8 weeks that life doesn't always go the way that we plan, does it? In fact, I've heard it said, if you want to make God laugh, just tell Him your plans. May be cliche, but there's truth in that, isn't there? But that can definitely be said in the life of Joseph, that life did not go the way that he had planned. Since we've taken our time walking through his story over the last 7 weeks, I want to just go back and a little bit of a refresher over some of the parts of the story that we've talked about before we get into our topic. So we started our story of Joseph with a bratty 17-year-old kid that thought that he was better than his brothers. Now this wasn't entirely his fault because his dad's preferential treatment of him and also some of the dreams that he had been having that his brothers and that his father would bow to him at some point. It would have been easy to get that big head, that arrogance. So it wasn't totally his fault, but Joseph just let these things kind of go to his head. And he led to his brothers hating him. And his brothers decided to take the opportunity to get rid of him one day. Now they were first going to kill him, but one of the brothers stepped up and stopped that plan. So instead of killing him, they sold him into slavery. I don't know which would have been worse, honestly. I think I would almost rather be killed than to be sold into slavery. But Joseph was taken down to Egypt, where he was sold again to Potiphar, who was a military official of Pharaoh. But God blessed Joseph through all of those situations. In his servitude to Potiphar, and Potiphar noticed God's preferential treatment towards Joseph. And he puts him in charge of his whole household. But unfortunately for Joseph, things don't really get any better there because Potiphar's wife then tries to start seducing him and taking him to bed. He refuses. She gets mad and she basically tells Potiphar that Joseph was trying to seduce her. Instead of killing him, he throws Joseph into prison. And while in prison, Joseph is continued to be blessed by God. The warden of the prison basically puts him in charge of all the other prisoners. Then 2 of Pharaoh's officials are thrown into prison, the cupbearer and the baker. They eventually join Joseph in prison. We're not told why they were put in prison, but they both have dreams the same night. Joseph interprets their dreams through God's power, and his interpretations are correct. The cupbearer is restored to his position while the baker is hanged for whatever his crime was. He tells the cupbearer to remember him and to ask Pharaoh to let him out of prison. The cupbearer forgets Joseph's kindness, however, and it's another 2 full years of being in prison for something that he didn't do before Pharaoh has a dream. He's troubled with that set of dreams no one can interpret, so the cupbearer finally remembers Joseph. He tells Pharaoh about him. Pharaoh sends for him, and Joseph says, "No, I can't do it, but again, through God's power, with God's help, I can interpret, or God will interpret your dreams." They're the same dream or the same meaning, that there's going to be 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of famine. And Pharaoh not only takes Joseph's warning, but he elevates Joseph to the place of an administrator over saving enough food and storing up food and protecting people from starvation during the years of famine. Things happen just as God revealed in the dreams, and 7 years of great abundance take place. And then the famine starts. But it's not just Egypt that's affected. It's all the surrounding countries as well, because they normally buy grain from Egypt. The land of Canaan, the place where Joseph was born and raised, where his whole family is from, is also devastated in this famine. So his father sends his brothers to buy grain. They don't recognize Joseph. They don't realize that it's their own brother who they thought was probably dead. But he decided not to act with revenge. It wasn't an easy decision. He tried and then would change his mind. But he eventually chooses to forgive them because he realizes that God has brought all of this about to save many lives. Last week we kind of talked about the idea of when Joseph revealed himself to his brothers and has his father and all his household brought to Egypt. And with Pharaoh's permission, their family settles in the land of Goshen. Now, this is the most fertile and equipped land in Egypt for shepherds, which the Egyptians hated, but that was what Joseph and his family were. The Egyptians were city dwellers. They didn't like those that worked out in the fields. But Jacob, Joseph's dad, lives out his final days in Egypt, and then he is taken back to his homeland and buried. We've learned a lot from the life of Joseph, and that was a very brief synopsis of what we've talked about. But over the last 8 weeks, we've talked about the idea of reliance on God, patience, forgiveness, what it means to be family, and the fact that this is not our home. We are sojourners in this land. And those are all great lessons for each and every one of us. And they all seem to have one thing in common. It comes down to a choice. Joseph chose to do those things. We have to choose to rely on God. We have to choose to have patience. We have to choose to forgive rather than take revenge. We have to choose to live as a part of our family. Sometimes that's easier said than done. And we have to choose to long for our true home so we can all get caught up in living for today and forget that we have a better home waiting for us. But there's another choice that Joseph seems to make, and it was a continuous choice that he made all throughout his life. And the reason that it hasn't been pointed out yet is that there's really nothing extraordinary about this choice. That's really the whole point of our message today. It's kind of boring. Joseph doesn't walk on water. He doesn't raise anyone from the dead. He's an administrator. And if there's any administrators here, I don't mean to say that your life is boring, but there's not a true excitement about some of the things like we read in other stories from the Bible. It doesn't mean, again, I don't mean to step on any toes if you fulfill that role in your life or your job. Don't get me wrong, we need those types of people. We need those types of roles. I get that. But when the people fulfilling these roles are the main character in a story, sometimes the story gets a little boring. And this is true in the life of Joseph. There's nothing really extraordinary about what he does. He doesn't do anything exciting. Again, he's not walking on water. He's not raising anyone from the dead. He's not even healing anyone. All he did was save the world from starvation. But he did it in an administrative type of way. He does it without any flair. He does it as that administrator. He comes up with a plan, he implements the plan, and the plan goes off without a hitch. Exactly what an administrator needs to do. But we look at stories throughout the Bible and we see miracle after miracle. The parting of the Red Sea while Moses is leading the children of Israel out of Egypt and fleeing from Pharaoh's army. Daniel in the lion's den. The 3 men in the fiery furnace. Healing after healing after healing in the life of Jesus. Even raising people from the dead, including Jesus. Along with people that the apostles healed after Jesus' resurrection. There's no doubt why we look at a story of Joseph and wonder why there wasn't a big miracle in it. But it's also the same reason that we can connect so well with the story of Joseph, because it's ordinary life. We relate to it. There's no big miracle, and while I think we still experience miracles and can still experience miracles in our lives today, a lot of times we have life like Joseph. It's because of this that I truly believe that we have a lot that we can learn from this story, though. There are plenty of things that we can easily implement in our lives if we're just willing to trust God. But that's a big if we're willing to trust God. And I have a confession to make before we go any further with this. And I think it's one that most of us, if we're honest with ourselves, can make as well. There's two sides to it, and really neither are the right way to live our lives. I'm talking about what we do when there's an issue or a problem in our lives. We tend to do one or the other. We either pray to God and then just sit back and expect Him or hope that He will fix everything miraculously, or we don't even think to pray and we just jump in and try to fix it on our own. Now, I'm in the second category. It's not that I don't trust God or that I don't want to pray. I just jump in before I take the time to do that sometimes. That's just something about my personality, and it's something I'm working on, something I'm trying to change. Again, it's not that I don't think that prayer is effective or that God won't help. It's just that I fall into that trap of being a doer. I want to do it. I want to fix it. I like to do things on my own. Teamwork is very important, however, and who better to work with than God? And that's something that I have to keep reminding myself. The other side of the issue is just expecting God to fix everything for us. And if you're in that category of praying and then doing nothing, I get it. Our God is big and can handle all of those situations. But sometimes He asks us not only to pray, but then to put some work in to it as well. Sometimes His answer to our prayers require work from us. He wants, for some reason, He wants us to work. I think because we take ownership of it. Things mean more when we have something to do about it. If we're always given everything, don't we tend to become reliant and needy? We expect everything to be handed to us, and that's not always the best way. The first time I realized that this issue was an issue in my life, and honestly most people's lives, is while reading one of my favorite authors. His name is Mark Batterson. Mark is the preaching and founding minister of National Community Church in Washington, D.C. In one of his books, The Circle Maker, Praying Circles Around Your Biggest Dreams and Greatest Fears, he talks about praying audacious prayers, big prayers, prayers that we don't think can happen any other way than God doing it. And he relates the story of a man named Honi in this book. And Honi calls him the circle maker. And Honi lived in Israel during what's known as the silent period. And what we mean by that is it's the time between the Old Testament and the New Testament, the 400 years in between, where God was seemingly silent. He didn't speak through any prophets. There was a drought in the land of Israel at that time, and the people were starting to suffer greatly. And Honi, as a leader in the community, he decided to draw a big circle in the sand, a literal circle in the sand. And he did this, and he was determined that he was going to not leave that circle until God provided rain. So he gets in this circle, he starts praying, and he prays and prays and prays. And they get rain. In fact, they got so much rain it flooded. His prayer was effective because he was there. That's exactly what happened with it. If you want to read more about it, it's a great read. It's something that I encourage you to look at on your own. There's a lot of great principles that he puts in it. And honestly, I can't remember if this idea is in the Circle Maker, if it's another one of his books, but Batterson has made me realize that trying to do something on our own is impossible, but just praying without action on our part is also impossible to get results. And knowing him and reading more of his stuff, I'm assuming that this is one way or another been in all of his books. But he puts it this way, sorry, on the screen: pray like it depends on God, but work like it depends on you. It's not a either or, it's a both and. Pray like it depends on God, but work like it depends on you. So here's the thing that we can learn from Joseph this week. We need to choose to trust God, but we also have to work hard. Don't get me wrong, we can't fall into that trap that thinking that praying is enough. Prayer is a vital part of the Christian life, so don't get me wrong in that. But there has to be action on our part as well. Again, sometimes God's answer is, okay, I will bless it, but put your work into it. God wants us to step out in faith and to work for the things that He's leading us towards, especially when life isn't going the way that we think it should. The best part about the whole thing is that this is a biblical principle. It really is. There are definitely stories like Joseph that show the principle, but there's one that explicitly states it. It's one of my favorite stories out of the Old Testament. It's the story of Nehemiah. And Nehemiah is full of action and praying to God like it depends on him, but it's also full of people working like it depended on them. Nehemiah was the cupbearer to the king while he was living in exile from Jerusalem. And he receives word that the walls of Jerusalem are in ruins and burning. And it disturbed him greatly. He spent many days weeping, mourning, and praying for God to correct this horrible situation. But then he didn't stop. He also put a plan into action. He goes and speaks to the king about this and asks permission to travel to Jerusalem and rebuild the walls. You may be saying that's not that big of a deal, but to speak to a king without permission, or even to appear in the king's presence with sadness, could have cost Nehemiah his life. The king gives him permission, however, and Nehemiah is allowed to go and rebuild. So the principle of prayer and action doesn't stop there, though, in the story. Once Nehemiah and some of the others that he recruited are back in Jerusalem, they're starting to rebuild. They run into some resistance from those in the land that don't want to see Jerusalem rebuilt. There are those in the area, again, that don't want to see that. They start attacking the workers, trying to halt the construction of the walls, because they know a fortified Jerusalem could be inhabited again. So skipping ahead in the story of Nehemiah to the 4th chapter, verses 7 through 9, we see his response to the attacks. He says, "But when Sanballat, Tobiah, and the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the people of Ashdod heard that the repairs to Jerusalem's walls had gone ahead and that the gaps were being closed, they were very angry, and they all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and stir up trouble again." And this is Nehemiah's own words in verse 9. "But we prayed to our God and posted a guard day and night to meet this threat." Now, I stressed it as I read through, but did you catch that last sentence? We prayed to our God and posted a guard. Nehemiah knew that it wasn't enough just to pray, but he also knew that it was good enough to try and protect the construction without prayer either. He knew that wasn't good enough. Joseph saved a country. In fact, he saved a lot of the world, but how? It may be boring on the outside. It may seem boring without any huge miracle, but he teaches us how to work things in our own lives. He trusts God in prayer, and then he comes up with and implements a plan to save not only Egypt, but the surrounding countries as well. He also sets up a new economy within Egypt that will turn Egypt into a huge power in the world. So he not only saves them, he actually betters Egypt through that. When we started this series, I explained that we would keep coming back to a certain New Testament passage. It's been our theme verse through this story. And I think there's only been a week or two in this series that we didn't explicitly read Romans 8:28. But it says, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who've been called according to His purpose." Now that we're closing out that series, I think it's important that we break that passage down just a little, and so we can try to get the meaning for all of us this morning. When you look at it, there are 3 parts to this verse, and each give a condition and for us to expect the promise of all things working together for our good. In other words, there are 3 conditions that we have to meet for this passage to apply to our lives. The first condition is that for all things working together for our good is that we must love God. That's first and foremost. We have to love God. That's exactly what Romans 8:28 says. And it keeps with what Jesus taught through His time on earth as well. During the last week of Jesus' life, He came under fire from the religious leaders of the day more so than at any other time in his ministry. They were looking for something to accuse him of, something to condemn him to death, and they were even willing to trap him in statements to do that. They questioned him constantly, even though they were not looking for answers that could enhance their faith. They only wanted to catch him in something that could, a mistake of doctrine or something that they could accuse him of and discredit him with the general population. That's what they were trying to do. But one of the most interesting times that they questioned him is found in Matthew 23. Matthew 23, 34 through 40. Matthew 22, 34 through 40. It says, hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together. One of them, an expert in the law, tested him with this question, Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? And Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. The second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. It seems to me that the point of the Pharisees' question was to force Jesus into elevating one of the 10 commandments. And the Jews thought that all 10 were equal. So the Pharisees thought that Jesus might choose one of them, and they could have drawn him into a theological discussion that would offend some of his followers. But instead, Jesus chooses to quote Deuteronomy 6:5, which states, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, or with all your strength. And in doing this, Jesus revealed to us the vital fundamental of Christianity. The most important thing that we can do is love God. Everything that we teach in church is predicated on that. We have to start there. We do it all for God. In Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, Jesus warns that not everyone who does powerful things for God will be going to heaven, but only those that know Him and know Jesus. In other words, only those that love Him. The second condition that we have to meet is that we must be called according to His purpose. In other words, we must be living according to God's will in our lives. And that's where we come to our Genesis passage this morning of Genesis 50, 15 through 21. This is at the very end of the story. And when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, what if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him? So they sent word to Joseph saying, your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you're to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father. When their message came to him, Joseph wept. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. We are your slaves, they said. But Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. When Jacob died, Joseph's brothers were scared. They were afraid that Joseph would seek revenge because they had sold him into slavery, because they had treated his father poorly. Or maybe, just maybe, that he had only been nice to them while their father was alive. And now that their father was gone, Joseph would use his power to enact his revenge. But he doesn't. But the question again is why? Because he wasn't trying to live in a way to please his earthly father, but he was living a life trying to please his heavenly Father. In other words, Joseph was under an obligation that was far more binding than doing what Jacob wanted him to do. He was living according to God's purpose for his life. And as a result, the promise of Romans 8:28, which is an eternal principle, was true for Joseph. All things work together for those who love God and are called to live according to His purposes. Joseph could see the good that had come from all of his hardships. As he had told his brothers, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is being done, the saving of many lives." And when Joseph was in the pit, when he was sold on the auction block, when he had been falsely accused and tossed into prison, and even when he had been forgotten by his fellow prisoners, Joseph had no way of knowing exactly what the good would be that came out of those experiences. He had no idea. He only knew that he had to make the right choices of trusting God. And in making the right choices, God brought something beautiful out of his life. He kept in mind that God was in control, but he knew he had to work as well. In the book, You'll Get Through This, Max Lucado puts it this way: you'd prefer a miracle for your crisis? You'd rather see bread multiplied or the stormy sea turned glass calm in a finger snap? God may do this. Then again, He may tell you, "I'm with you. I can use this for good. Now let's make a plan." Trust Him to help you. Lucado also includes some words from a study that was conducted looking into the reason that some companies thrive and some die in uncertain times or in bad economies. Jim Collins, a management guru, is quoted by Lucado summing up his conclusion to the question, again, on why some companies succeed and others don't. He records, "Successful leaders are not more creative, they're not more visionary, they're not more charismatic, they're not more ambitious. They're not more blessed by luck, they're not more risk-seeking, they're not more heroic, and they're not more prone to making big, bold moves. Then what sets them apart? They all led their teams with surprising method of self-control in an out-of-control world." So what does that tell us? It tells us that we need to keep calm and know that in our crisis, God's got this. And we said earlier in our series that every 6 months, a family will experience some kind of crisis. We need to rely on Him in prayer, but then we need to put a plan in action together. In other words, we need to keep calm and carry on. Are you aware of where that phrase comes from? I know a lot of people use that phrase now. You see it everywhere and even in many different forms. In fact, one of my favorites is "keep calm and sing Rocky Top." But then how can you keep calm when Rocky Top's playing? But if you don't know, Rocky Top's the fight song for the University of Tennessee. But the origin of the original phrase and why it's now so popular is actually a really interesting story. In the days leading up to the war with Germany in World War II, the British government commissioned a series of posters. And the idea was to capture encouraging slogans on paper and distribute them around the country. Capital letters in a distinct type were used, and a simple two-color format was selected. The only graphic was the crown of King George VI. The first was distributed in September of 1939. It said, "Your courage, your cheerfulness, your resolution will bring us victory." Soon after, a second poster was produced. "Freedom is in peril. Defend it with all your might." These two appeared up and down the British countryside, on railroad platforms and in pubs, stores, and restaurants. They were everywhere. A third poster was created, but it was never distributed. More than 2.5 million copies were printed, yet never seen until nearly 60 years after the war, when a bookstore owner in northeast England discovered one in a box of old books that he had purchased at auction. And it read, "Keep calm and carry on." The poster bore the same crown, the same style of the first two, but it was never released to the public. It was held in reserve for an extreme crisis such as an invasion by Germany. The bookstore owner framed it and he hung it on the wall, and it became so popular that the bookstore began producing identical images of it, of the original design on coffee mugs, on postcards, on posters. Everyone, it seems, appreciated the reminder from another generation to keep calm and carry on. And when crisis hits your life, and they will, again, remember the life of Joseph. How do I know that we'll have crisis in our lives? Again, we said this earlier in our series when we introduced this 8 weeks ago, that a statistic states that a family will experience a crisis every 6 months. Now, that could be a small crisis or a big crisis, but a crisis nonetheless. Life does not always go the way that we think it will or should. And that's okay, because we've got a God that works all things for our good, if we love Him and if we live according to His will. Just remember to pray and to rely on Him, and then go to work. When that next crisis hits, my challenge to you is just keep calm and carry on. And we keep calm and carry on through Jesus Christ. And if you never accepted Him as your Lord and Savior, today would be a great day to do so. Any decision you need to make, now's the time to do so as we sing "The Savior is Waiting," number 483.